The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday wedged between a furniture catalog and a credit card offer Marcus had no intention of accepting. He might have ignored it entirely had the bold red URGNT stamp not caught his eye as he sorted through his mail at the kitchen counter. 38 years old, with premature silver threading through his dark hair and the perpetually tired eyes of someone who spent too many years working 60-hour weeks at an architecture firm, Marcus Delgado didn't receive certified mail often. It felt ominous, like a summons or a death notice. He tore it open with his index finger, wincing as the paper sliced a thin paper cut across his skin. As he read the letter's contents, the small sting in his finger became the least of his concerns. Notice of property line dispute, heading announced in bold, bureaucratic font. The letter, sent by the Oak Ridge Community Council, informed him that a recent survey had determined that approximately 20 feet of what Marcus had believed to be his backyard actually belonged to the community. Public property. The cherry tree his daughter had planted 5 years ago. Community property. The hammock where he read on Sunday afternoons, strung between trees on community land. A small garden shed where he kept his tools, trespassing on community soil. "This can't be right," Marcus muttered, reaching for his phone to call his wife, Layla. She answered on the third ring. "You're saying part of our yard isn't ours," he said without preamble. "What? Who's saying that?" Layla's voice crackled through the speaker. "The community council. I've had a letter here claiming that about a third of our backyard is actually public property. They want us to remove our stuff and," he squinted at the paper, "restore the natural landscape to its original condition for community enjoyment." "That's ridiculous. We've lived here for 8 years. Nobody's ever said anything before." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood he'd never outgrown. Apparently there was a survey. Something about original property lines being incorrectly marked when the subdivision was built. "What does this mean for us? They can't just take our land, can they?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, staring out the kitchen window at the yard in question. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass where his 10-year-old daughter Zoe had left her soccer ball. "The letter says we have 14 days to comply or face fines." That evening, after Zoe went to bed, Marcus and Layla spread out old property documents on their dining room table. The deed, the mortgage paperwork, the inspection report. Nothing suggested that the property line was anywhere other than where they'd always believed it to be. The wooden fence that enclosed their yard had been there since before they bought the house. "We need to talk to a lawyer," Layla said finally, pushing a strand of curly hair behind her ear. "This doesn't make sense." "I'll call Ben tomorrow," Marcus agreed, referring to his college roommate who'd gone on to become a real estate attorney. "But I looked up the community council online after I got the letter. They've been on some kind of crusade lately. Apparently they're trying to reclaim public spaces all over the neighborhood." "But our backyard isn't a public space," Layla protested. Marcus's jaw tightened. Try telling them that. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned beside his peacefully slumbering wife, his mind racing with possibilities, each more frustrating than the last. By the time dawn broke, painting his bedroom ceiling with pale pink light, a plan had begun to form, outlandish and probably ill-advised, but somehow perfect in its absurdity. If they claimed it was public property, perhaps the public deserved a space worthy of the designation, something the community could truly enjoy, something impossible to ignore. Marcus smiled in the half-light. He'd need sand. Lots and lots of sand. 20 tons of sand, Marcus repeated, leaning against the kitchen counter the next morning. His cell phone was wedged between his ear and shoulder as he scribbled numbers on a yellow legal pad. "Yes, playground grade, clean, and I'll need it delivered by Friday." Across the kitchen, Layla nearly choked on her coffee. She mouthed 20 tons with widened eyes. Marcus gave her a thumbs up, his expression caught somewhere between mischief and determination. "Perfect. And you can dump it right over the fence in the back corner?" "Excellent." He hummed up and turned to his wife with a grin that belonged on a much younger man. "Marcus Delgado, have you lost your mind?" Layla asked, though the corners of her mouth were fighting a smile. "Actually, I think I've found it." He crossed to the kitchen table and spread out a sketch he'd drawn during his pre-dawn inspiration. The detailed rendering showed a massive sandbox, not a modest square suitable for a child's play, but an elaborate construction that occupied precisely the disputed 20 feet of their yard. "Ben called back this morning while you were in the shower," Marcus explained. "He thinks we have a good case, but these disputes can drag on for months. The council is within their rights to request we remove our personal items until it's resolved." "So your solution is to bury our yard in sand?" Layla raised an eyebrow. "Not bury, transform. If they want public property, I'm creating the ultimate public amenity. A community sandbox. Think about it, the kids around here will love it. The neighbors are going to think we've gone insane. Possibly. But technically, I'm just complying with the council's demand. I'm removing our personal items and creating a space for community enjoyment. Sand is natural. Kids love sand. What could be more community-friendly than a giant sandbox? Layla studied the sketch more closely. This is actually well designed. I am an architect, Marcus reminded her with mock indignation. I've included a border of landscape timbers to contain the sand, beach toys that can be mounted to posts so they don't disappear, even a small shade structure. It'll be the Taj Mahal of sandboxes. It's also passive-aggressive as hell, Layla noted. Creatively passive-aggressive, Marcus corrected, tapping his pencil against the paper. There's a difference. That afternoon, Marcus took a rare half-day from work and visited 3 different hardware stores, loading his SUV with landscape timbers, galvanized brackets, outdoor-grade screws, and an assortment of colorful beach toys. He needed help with the construction, but fortunately, his neighbor Dan owed him a favor after Marcus had helped rebuild Dan's deck the previous summer. By the time Zoe returned from school, the backyard had transformed into a construction zone. Tools were laid out in precise rows, and Marcus was measuring and marking the ground with spray paint. "What are you doing, Dad?" Zoe asked, dropping her backpack on the patio. "Building the neighborhood's biggest sandbox," Marcus answered, straightening up. "Wanna help?" Zoe's face lit up. "Really? Can I invite Emma and Tyler to play in it when it's done?" "That's the whole point, sweetheart. According to the community council, this part of our yard belongs to everyone, so we're making something everyone can enjoy." Zoe frowned slightly, processing this information. "But it's our yard." "That's what I thought too," Marcus said, ruffling her hair. "But sometimes when grown-ups can't agree on things, you'd have to get creative." That evening, Dan came over with beer and his power tools, and the 2 men worked until dusk, setting the heavy timber border in place. They dug 6 inches into the soil to secure the base layer, creating a sturdy frame for the sand that would arrive in 2 days. "You know the council's going to have a fit when they see this," Dan said, taking a long pull from his beer as they surveyed their progress. "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied, his voice calm but his eyes gleaming with defiance. "They wanted public property. I'm just making sure it lives up to its designation." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By Thursday evening, several curious neighbors had wandered by, ostensibly walking their dogs or out for an evening stroll, but lingering near Marcus's fence long enough to ask questions. To each, Marcus cheerfully explained the situation, showing them the certified letter and his meticulously drawn plans. Most laughed, offering encouragement or sharing their own stories of bureaucratic absurdity. A few promised to bring their children once the sandbox was completed. One elderly woman who served on the garden committee suggested adding native plants around the perimeter to soften the statement. Only one neighbor, a thin-lipped man who Marcus knew served on the community council, observed the construction with open disapproval before hurrying away, phone already in hand. "I think the battle lines are being drawn," Layla observed that night as they lay in bed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Marcus stared at the ceiling, his architect's mind visualizing the completed project. "The sand arrives tomorrow," he said simply. "It's too late to back out now." What he didn't mean to say because Layla already knew, was that this was about more than 20 feet of yard. It was about the home they'd made, the memories they'd built, and a principle that mattered more than peace. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you had to fight with 20 tons of playground sand. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself approved of Marcus's plan. He'd taken the day off works, something he rarely did outside of planned vacations, and stood in his driveway at 7:30 a.m. waiting for the delivery truck with the anticipation of a child on Christmas morning. Layla had already left for her shift at the hospital, with a mixture of support and concern in her goodbye kiss. "Try not to get arrested before I get home," she said with a wry smile. "No promises," he replied, only half joking. The rumble of a heavy diesel engine announced the arrival of his delivery. A massive dump truck turned onto his street, slowing as it approached his house. Marcus waved, directing the driver around to the alley that ran behind the properties. Several neighbors, having heard about the impending delivery, had positioned themselves strategically on porches or in gardens, pretending to be engaged in morning routines while watching the spectacle unfold. The truck driver, a weathered man named Roy, who looked like he'd seen every kind of unusual delivery request in his 30 years of hauling, didn't bat an eye when Marcus explained exactly where he wanted the sand dumped. "Over the fence, right into that framed area," Marcus pointed. Roy nodded. "Not my first divorce revenge project," he commented. Marcus laughed. "Not divorce. Just making a point about property rights." Roy shrugged. "Same difference. Making a statement's making a statement." The hydraulics whined as the truck bed slowly tilted upward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a slow-motion avalanche, tons of pristine beach sand began to cascade over Marcus's fence, landing squarely within the timber-framed area with a satisfying hiss. The pile grew higher and higher, a miniature dune forming in suburban Illinois. The fresh sand caught the morning light, almost glittering against the green of the surrounding lawn. Marcus couldn't suppress his grin. It was even better than he had imagined. By mid-morning, the sand had been delivered, Roy had departed with a bemused salute, and Marcus was using a rake to level the enormous pile. The sandbox was substantial, 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, occupying almost the entire disputed area. At the edges, the sand was a respectable 12 inches deep, while the center mounted to nearly 3 feet. It was magnificent in its absurdity. As he worked, a small audience gathered at the periphery of his yard. Mrs. Peterson from 2 doors down brought him a glass of lemonade. The Thompsons' twin boys stood at the fence, their eyes wide with undisguised longing. "Can we play in it, Mr. Delgado?" One of them, Marcus could never tell them apart, asked. Marcus leaned on his rake. "Not quite yet, buddy. I need to finish the border and set up the toys. But it should be ready by tomorrow. And remember, according to the community council, this is public property now, so it'll be open to everyone." The boy's face lit up as he ran to tell his brother the good news. Around noon, just as Marcus was mounting large, colorful shovels and buckets on posts around the perimeter of the sandbox, his architect's eye for detail ensuring they were both functional and aesthetically pleasing, a black SUV pulled up in front of his house. A woman in a charcoal pantsuit emerged, her expression suggesting she'd recently bitten into something sour. She marched up his driveway with clipboard in hand. "Mr. Delgado," she called as she approached the gate to the backyard. Marcus set down his drill and dusted sand from his hands. "That's me. Vivian Hartwick, Oak Ridge Community Council." She adjusted her glasses and looked past him at the enormous sandbox. For a moment, her professional composure faltered, her mouth forming a small O surprise. "Impressive, isn't it?" Marcus offered. Recovering quickly, Vivian consulted her clipboard. "Mr. Delgado, we've received several calls about unusual activity on the community property adjacent to your residence. I see the reports were accurate." Her gaze swept over the sandbox again, a mixture of disbelief and annoyance crossing her features. "Just following the council's instructions," Marcus said pleasantly. The letter said to remove personal items and restore the area for community enjoyment. Kids enjoy sand. Ergo sandbox. "This is not what the council meant by community enjoyment," Vivian said, her voice tightening. "No. The letter wasn't specific about acceptable forms of community enjoyment. It just said to clear private property and create a space for public use. That's exactly what I've done." "Mr. Delgado, this is clearly a hostile action designed to—" "Hostile?" Marcus interrupted, gesturing to the sandbox. "I've spent considerable time and money creating a safe play area for neighborhood children. I've used child-safe materials, installed shade for some protection, and even mounted toys so they can't be lost or stolen. In what way is that hostile?" Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "The council will consider this an act of deliberate provocation. The council is welcome to their opinion," Marcus replied, his tone still pleasant but his eyes hardening. "Just as I'm welcome to improve public property in a way that benefits the community, unless there's a specific bylaw against sandboxes that I'm unaware of." They stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them practically crackling with tension. Finally, Vivian made a note on her clipboard. "The council will be in touch, Mr. Delgado. In the meantime, I should warn you that if this installation creates any nuisance or safety hazard, you will be held liable." "Noted," Marcus said with a nod. "Safety is my top priority. That's why I've installed drainage beneath the sand and used rounded-edged timbers for the border. I'm also adding a sign with rules about keeping the area clean and covering the sandbox when not in use. Would you like to see my design specs?" Vivian didn't dignify his offer with a response. With a final disapproving glance at the sandbox, she turned and walked briskly back to her SUV. As she drove away, Dan appeared from his yard next door, a cold beer in each hand. He passed one to Marcus. "I caught most of that," he said, nodding in the direction of the departing vehicle. "Round one to Delgado, I'd say." Marcus took a long sip of beer. "Maybe. But something tells me the council isn't going to let this go easily." "Worth it, though?" Dan asked, gesturing at the sandbox with his bottle. Marcus surveyed his creation, the pristine sand catching the midday sun, the colorful toys standing ready for eager hands, the shaded bench he'd positioned for parents to watch their children play. Something tight in his chest loosened at the sight. "Absolutely worth it," he answered with certainty. What he didn't say was that for the first time since receiving that certified letter, he felt like he had some control back. He might lose this patch of land in the end, but he wouldn't surrender it without making his point. Sometimes, he reflected, the most effective response to bureaucratic overreach wasn't a lawsuit or a petition or even a strongly worded letter. Sometimes you just needed 20 tons of sand and a point to prove. By Saturday afternoon, the Great Sandbox Rebellion, as it had come to be known throughout the neighborhood, was in full swing. What began as Marcus's solitary act of creative defiance had transformed into something unexpected, a gathering place. Children from blocks away arrived with plastic buckets and miniature shovels, their parents in tow. Toddlers squealed with delight as they buried their feet in the cool sand. Older kids constructed elaborate castles and tunnels with surprising engineering skill. Marcus, who had planned to spend the day fine-tuning the sandbox, instead found himself serving as an unofficial host. He'd set up a small table near the gate with a water dispenser and paper cups, addressing both hydration needs and the inevitable sand-in-mouth incidents. Layla, initially skeptical but now fully committed to the cause, circulated with homemade cookies on a tray. The Petersons just arrived with their granddaughter, she reported, sidling up to Marcus as he refilled the water dispenser. "That's 4 more for Team Sandbox, and Mrs. Grayson brought lemonade." "We might need more cups," Marcus said, surveying the scene with a mix of pride and amazement. At least 30 people milled around their backyard, most of them neighbors he'd barely spoken to before this week. "I had no idea there were this many kids in the neighborhood." "It's not just the sandbox," Layla observed. "People love a good rebellion against authority, especially when it involves cookies and has a stick-it-to-the-man vibe." A sudden eruption of childish laughter drew their attention to the sandbox, where Zoe was leading a group of kids in burying Dan up to his neck in sand. His face wore an expression of long-suffering patience that suggested this wasn't his first time serving as a human sandbox prop. "Your friend's a good sport," Layla said, smiling at the scene. "He enjoys the attention," Marcus replied. "Plus, I promised him free beer for a month." The impromptu community gathering continued throughout the afternoon. Someone brought a portable speaker and laid-back summer tunes mingled with the sounds of play. The Johnsons from across the street arrived with their grill and started cooking hot dogs. Mrs. Peters from the garden committee appeared with trays of seedlings and quietly began planting borders of native flowers around the sandbox, just as she had suggested. It was, Marcus reflected, exactly the kind of community enjoyment that the council's letter had demanded, though surely not what they had envisioned. Around 4 o'clock, as the gathering was in full swing, a sleek black Tesla pulled up alongside the curb. Gerald Whitfield, president of the Oak Ridge Community Council, emerged wearing crisp khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe. His wife Miranda, resplendent in white linen that somehow remained spotless despite the summer heat, joined him. They stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, taking in the scene with matching expressions of displeasure. "Incoming," Dan muttered, having finally extracted himself from his sandy tomb. "The king and queen have arrived." Marcus straightened up, brushing sand from his shorts. "I should go say hello." "Want backup?" Layla asked quietly. "No, I've got this." Marcus squeezed her hand reassuringly and made his way to the gate where the Whitfields waited, Gerald's arms crossed over his chest in what he probably thought was an intimidating pose. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield," Marcus greeted them with forced cheerfulness. "Welcome to our community sandbox. Can I offer you some lemonade?" "Mr. Delgado," Gerald said, ignoring the offer, "this has gone far enough. You've made your point." Marcus feigned confusion. "My point? I'm just following the council's directive to make this public property available for community enjoyment. Based on the turnout, I'd say it's been quite successful." "This is a mockery of the council's authority," Gerald replied, his voice low but intense. "You know very well that this spectacle was not what we intended." "Then perhaps the council should have been more specific in their letter," Marcus suggested mildly. "As an architect, I appreciate clear specifications." Miranda Whitfield, who had been surveying the crowd with thinly veiled disdain, suddenly stiffened. "Gerald, the Hendersons are here, and the Chens. They're board members at the country club." Gerald followed her gaze to where 2 well-dressed couples chatted amicably while their children played in the sand. "What are they doing here?" he muttered, his composure slipping slightly. "Enjoying public property," Marcus offered helpfully. "Their kids seem to love the sandbox." Gerald's jaw tightened. "This isn't over, Delgado. The council meeting is on Monday evening. I suggest you attend if you want to have any say in what happens next." "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus assured him. As the Whitfields retreated to their Tesla, Dan appeared at Marcus's side with 2 fresh beers. "Round 2 to Delgado?" he suggested, offering one to Marcus. "Maybe," Marcus said, watching the Tesla pull away. "But Gerald's right. This isn't over." "You worried?" Dan asked. Marcus took a thoughtful sip of his beer. "Less than I was. Look around, Dan. The council can't just bulldoze this now. Too many people would be upset." And it was true. What had begun as a personal battle over property lines had evolved into something larger. The Sandbox had become a symbol of neighborhood camaraderie, of resistance to bureaucratic overreach of summer itself. Children who had previously been strangers were now playing together. Adults who had only exchanged perfunctory nods for years were sharing food and conversation. Later that evening, as the gathering finally wound down and the last families headed home with tired, sand-covered children, Marcus and Layla sat on their patio with glasses of wine. "I never expected this," Marcus admitted, gesturing toward the sandbox, now quiet but bearing the evidence of a day well spent. Dozens of footprints, half-finished sand castles, and the occasional forgotten toy. "I thought I was just being petty." "You were," Layla laughed, nudging him with her shoulder. "But sometimes petty actions have unexpected consequences. The council meeting on Monday will be interesting," Marcus mused. "Gerald's going to try to shut this down." "Let him try," Layla said, her voice taking on an unusual edge. "He'll have to go through me first, and Mrs. Peterson. And probably the Johnsons too after today." Marcus looked at his wife with surprise and affection. She'd initially viewed his sandbox plan as an amusing but slightly embarrassing overreaction. Now she sounded ready to chain herself to it in protest if necessary. "What changed your mind?" he asked. Layla was quiet for a moment, watching as total lights settled over there. The Oak Ridge Community Center's main meeting room was designed to accommodate 30 people comfortably. On Monday evening, it held nearly 100, with latecomers lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The sudden public interest in municipal zoning ordinances and property line disputes had clearly caught the council off guard. Marcus spotted several harried-looking staffers hurriedly setting up additional folding chairs as the crowd continued to grow. "I think half the neighborhood is here," Layla whispered, scanning the packed room. She'd come straight from her hospital shift, still wearing scrubs under her light jacket. Zoe sat between them, unusually subdued in the formal setting, but clutching a folder containing what she had described as evidence. Marcus nodded, equally surprised by the turnout. He recognized families who had visited the sandbox, neighbors he'd never spoken to before Saturday, and even a few faces he didn't recognize at all. Mrs. Peterson sat in the front row with a handmade sign on her lap that read, "Save our sandbox," in glitter glue. The twins' parents, the Thompsons, had brought what appeared to be a petition. Dan lounged against the back wall, offering Marcus a surreptitious thumbs up. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Gerald Whitfield called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. Seated at a long table with the 6 other council members, he looked simultaneously irritated and smug, a man confident in his authority despite the unexpected audience. "Before we address the regular agenda items," Gerald announced, "we'll open the floor to public comments on the recent unauthorized construction on community property at 428 Maple Street." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus felt Layla's hand find his, her fingers cool and steady against his palm. "The council reminds all speakers that comments are limited to 2 minutes," Gerald continued. "We'll begin with—" "Point of order," interrupted a woman from the second row whom Marcus recognized as Janet Chen, one of the country club board members who had visited the sandbox. "Council procedure requires that the issue be presented before public comments are taken." Gerald's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. You're absolutely correct." He shuffled some papers before continuing. "As many of you are aware, a recent property survey commissioned by the council identified several instances of private encroachment on community lands throughout Oak Ridge. In accordance with our responsibility to protect public assets, notices were sent to the affected homeowners requesting that they remove private property and restore the land to its natural state." He paused, his gaze finding Marcus in the crowd. In one case, a homeowner responded by constructing an unauthorized recreational facility, specifically a large sandbox on community property. This installation was done without permits, without approval of design or materials, and in clear defiance of council authority. Another council member, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses whom Marcus recognized as Walter Simmons, leaned toward his microphone. "The council's recommendation is to remove the unauthorized structure immediately and bill the homeowner for restoration costs and applicable fines." The chorus of disapproving murmurs swept through the room. "Now," Gerald continued, raising his voice slightly, "we'll open the floor to public comments. Please keep in mind that while we value community input, the final decision rests with the council." "Mrs. Peterson, I believe you were first on the list." Mrs. Peterson rose slowly, leaning on her cane. At 78, she was one of the neighborhood's oldest residents, and Marcus knew from Layla that she had been a civil rights activist in her youth. That fighting spirit was still evident as she squared her shoulders and faced the council. "I've lived in Oak Ridge for 42 years, she began, her voice surprisingly strong. "I've seen councils come and go. Some good, some not so good. But I've never seen one try to take away something that brings joy to children." She held up her glitter-adorned sign. "That sandbox has done more to build community in 3 days than this council has done in 3 years." My granddaughters visited yesterday. It was the first time they played with the Thompson twins, the first time they met little Amy Lou from 2 streets over. They're already planning to meet there again next weekend. Gerald cleared his throat. While we appreciate the social benefits, Mrs. Peterson, the issue is one of proper procedure and the issue, Mrs. Peterson interrupted firmly, is common sense. If that land truly belongs to the community, then the community should decide how it's used. And we decided. We want the sandbox. Applause erupted through the room. Gerald banged his gavel several times before order was restored. The next 30 minutes followed a similar pattern. One by one, neighbors approached the microphone to speak in favor of the sandbox. The Thompsons presented their petition with over 100 signatures. Janet Chen questioned the legality of the council's property line reassessment without adequate notification to homeowners. A local pediatrician spoke about the developmental benefits of outdoor play. Even Marcus's usually taciturn male carrier testified to the positive change in neighborhood atmosphere. Not everyone was supportive. 3 residents voiced concerns about sand being tracked onto sidewalks and one worried about the sandbox attracting cats. But the overwhelming sentiment was clear. The sandbox had become a beloved community asset. Finally, it was Marcus' turn to speak. He approached the microphone, acutely aware of the room's attention. He had prepared a statement about property rights and the overreach of the council, but looking at the faces of his neighbors, many of whom he had only truly met in the past 3 days, he set those notes aside. 3 months ago, he began, I wouldn't have recognized half the people in this room. We lived next to each other, but we didn't know each other. Then the council sent me a letter claiming that part of my backyard wasn't mine after all, it belonged to all of us. He paused, scanning the council members' faces. At first, I was angry. I built that sandbox as a protest, a way to turn the council's demand into something ridiculous. But something unexpected happened. A community formed around that pile of sand. Children who had never met before became friends. Parents who had only exchanged polite nods for years sat together and talked. For the first time since we moved to Oak Ridge, it felt like a real neighborhood. Marcus reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. My attorney has reviewed our property deed and the original subdivision plans. He believes we have a strong case that the land in question is legally ours and always has been. A flicker of concern crossed Gerald's face. But that's not the point anymore, Marcus continued. The council said this land belongs to the community, and the community has spoken. They want a sandbox. So regardless of who technically owns those 20 feet, I'm proposing that we formalize its status as a neighborhood play area. My family will maintain it, provide liability.